The ancient world gets misquoted a lot. The Library of Alexandria didn't vanish in one epic fire. Pandora didn't open a box, and Druids had nothing to do with Stonehenge. Some of these myths came from bad history. Others were just made up later and stuck. But before we tear them apart, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so I can keep bringing you lists like this. I'm Mike with List 25, and these are 25 common myths about ancient civilizations debunked. 25. Pandora didn't open a box. Let's get this one out of the way immediately. The story goes that Pandora, the first woman on Earth, couldn't resist opening a mysterious box she got from Zeus. She took her peek and outflew every trouble known to humanity, leaving only hope trapped inside. It's been told so many times that Pandora's box has basically become a common noun, but the Greeks never talked about a box at all. In Hesiod's version, Zeus gave her a pithos, a massive clay storage jar used for things like olive oil. The box came from a 16th century translation slip by Erasmus of Rotterdam, who confused pithos with pyxis, meaning a small box. One mistranslation later, and the imagery stuck for centuries. 24. Great Zimbabwe wasn't built by outsiders. When European explorers first saw the ruins of Great Zimbabwe in the 1800s, they simply refused to believe that the local Africans could have built it. The towering stone walls, elaborate passageways, and precise masonry were instead credited to the Phoenicians, the Queen of Sheba, or some other far-off civilization. That changed when archaeologists David Randall McIver in 1905 and Gertrude Catton Thompson in 1929 proved the city was in fact homegrown. They uncovered pottery, iron tools, and everyday objects identical to those used by local communities, along with dry stone masonry techniques still practiced by Shona builders. Even the settlement's layout and nearby agricultural terraces matched indigenous patterns from the same area. Today, Great Zimbabwe is recognized for what it really is, one of Africa's greatest medieval achievements. 23. Amazonian warriors didn't cut off one of their breasts. You've probably heard the horrifying claim that the Amazons gave up a breast for the sake of better archery. That whole idea started with a bad bit of ancient wordplay, reading Amazon as Greek for without breast, but it's never been backed by evidence. Burials of real steppe warrior women, who everyone believes were the inspiration for the Amazon myth, show no skeletal signs of such mutilation. And it wouldn't have made sense anyway. Archers don't need surgery to shoot straight. If clothing got in the way, bindings did the job just fine. Most historians see the one breast detail as nothing more than a Greek invention, a way to make those foreign fighters seem more exotic or intimidating. 22. The Romans weren't slipping away to be sick. A lot of people first heard about the idea from the Hunger Games, where guests at a lavish capital party sip a drink to make themselves sick so they can keep eating. That scene sparked a wave of fun facts claiming the Romans did the same thing, even if they had a special room for it. The truth is, those vomit rooms weren't for food at all. Roman stadiums and theaters had big exit tunnels built to let crowds spill out quickly after an event. The Latin word for them, vomitorium, comes from vomere, meaning to spew forth, as in people leaving, not dinner making a return. The whole idea of Romans sneaking off to throw up during dinner is just silliness. 21. Athenian democracy wasn't like ours. Athens in the 5th century BCE gets a lot of credit as the birthplace of democracy, and yes, they did come up with demokratia, rule by the people. The catch is, their definition of people was very limited. Women couldn't vote. Neither could slaves nor foreigners. All in all, maybe 10 to 20% of the population actually had political rights. Unlike most modern democracies, Athens didn't elect representatives to make laws for them. Citizens voted directly on the laws themselves, and many public officials were picked by lottery. It was amazing for the time, but nowhere near the all-inclusive idea we have today. Large parts of the city, I'd say the majority, had no say at all in how it was run. 20. The Great Wall isn't one continuous structure from a single era. Most people imagine the Great Wall as a single structure that winds across the country and ends at the sea. And while that idea is spectacular, that image is wrong. In reality, the Great Wall is a network of walls, trenches, watchtowers, and natural barriers built over many centuries by different dynasties. Some sections run alongside each other, built at different times for different purposes. Others have large gaps, where mountains, rivers, or cliffs acted as natural defenses. Dynasties like the Qin, Han, Northern Qi, and Ming each added to, rebuilt, or connected certain parts, often directly over older walls. If you measure every known section, including overlapping walls and natural barriers, it is longer than 13,000 miles, or about 21,000 kilometers. That is far beyond the length of any single route you might picture. So it's more accurate to see it as a patchwork of defenses stitched together over 2,000 years. 19. The Colossus of Rhodes didn't straddle the harbor. If you've never heard of the Colossus of Rhodes before, well, I'm glad you're here. Ancient writers like Strabo and Pliny the Elder described it clearly, so we know it really existed. Just think of the Argonath, those giant statues in Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring. It was a massive bronze statue about 108 feet or 33 meters tall, built in the 3rd century BCE to celebrate a military victory. It stood for about 54 years before an earthquake snapped it at the knees. The remains stayed where they fell for centuries, and visitors in Roman times wrote about walking between the massive broken pieces. Now, the popular version says it stood with its legs apart over the entrance to Mendraki Harbor. According to ancient sources, however, it never stood that way at all. Writers from Rhodes' own time described it as standing on solid ground beside the harbor entrance. Building it across the water would have been almost impossible. And if it ever collapsed, it would have blocked one of Rhodes' busiest ports. The over-the-harbor pose was pure Renaissance imagination, added centuries later to make the story more poetic. 18. Christians were not fed to the lions in the Colosseum. It's painted in churches, shown in movies, and gets retold in religious services everywhere. But the historical records do not really match the picture. While some Christians were killed in the Roman Empire by being thrown to wild animals, a penalty called damnatio ad bestias, there's no reliable evidence that this happened on a large scale in the Colosseum. When the persecutions took place, especially under the ancient rulers like Nero or Diocletian, they were more often held in other venues, such as the Circus Maximus, provincial amphitheaters, or sites outside Rome. The Colosseum's connection to Christian martyrdom grew much later, when it became a symbol of persecution. 17. The Indus Valley's fall wasn't caused by a sudden invasion. Neither was it very peaceful. The Harappan or Indus Valley civilization has been described as unusually harmonious, with no warfare, no sharp class divisions, and no signs of conflict. The advanced city layouts and lack of obvious weapons even seem to back that up. And yet, more recent studies have uncovered a different story. Skeletal remains from the later period show more injuries, signs of people turning on each other, and poorer overall health. Life was getting harder, society was clearly under strain, and the gap between the well-off and everyone else was widening. On top of that, the climate was shifting and trade was drying up, both of which pushed the civilization towards collapse. 16. Stonehenge wasn't built by Druids. If the only time you've seen Stonehenge is in photos from the summer solstice, you might think Druids had a hand in building it. People in flowing robes still gather there every year, which makes the connection feel ancient. But the monument was already old by the time the first Druids ever appeared. Archaeology shows that Stonehenge was completed sometime between 2400 and 2000 BCE, more than 1,000 years before Druids were first mentioned in the historical record. The link to Celtic priests came much later, in the 16 and 1700s, when writers like John Aubrey and William Stukeley guessed, incorrectly I might add, that Druids were the builders. Archaeologists now credit the construction to Neolithic Britons, who in all likelihood built it for ceremonies connected to burials and the movement of the sun. 15. Ancient armor was not that heavy. We tend to think that ancient armor weighed a ton and pinned soldiers in place, but it was designed to let them move. The Roman lorica segmentata, those overlapping metal plates you've seen in the movies, usually weighed between 20 and 30 pounds, or 9 to 13.5 kilograms. That's less than a modern firefighter's gear, which can be as heavy as 45 to 75 pounds, 20 to 34 kilograms. The design spread the weight evenly and allowed soldiers to run, kneel, and swing a sword without feeling like they were trapped inside a tin can. It also let them carry a shield and weapons without being overloaded. Their armor was made to work with them, not against them. 14. The Persian army at Thermopylae wasn't that big. Have you seen the movie 300? Popular versions of the battle at Thermopylae make it sound like 300 Spartans faced off against an army of Persians that stretched as far as the eye could see. Ancient historian Herodotus claims Xerxes brought around 1.7 million soldiers into Greece in 480 BCE, and some later accounts push that number even higher. Modern historians know those numbers don't add up. Moving and feeding even 50,000 troops in the ancient world was a huge logistical challenge, and nothing in the archaeological record, from camp sizes to supply chains, points to an army in the millions. Most credible estimates put that Persian force somewhere between 100 and 300,000. That was still overwhelming compared to the few thousand Greek defenders, don't get me wrong, but the million-man army story was mostly about making the Greek stand look impossibly heroic. 13. The ancient Greeks didn't wear togas. The toga wasn't Greek at all. It started with the Etruscans, who called it the tabena before the Romans made it their own and renamed it. In Rome, the toga came in different colors and styles, sometimes with patterns. And the bright white version, the toga candida, was worn by those running for public office. That's actually where we get the word candidate, in case you were wondering. Ancient Greeks had their own clothing traditions. They wore garments like the chiton, peplos, and himation, all made from draped fabric. And despite how movies and paintings often show them, these weren't tossed straight over bare skin. They layered them over a loincloth called a perizoma, worn by both men and women. 12. The Minoans weren't wiped out by the Thera eruption. One of the most famous ancient disaster theories is that Santorini's eruption wiped out the Minoans and gave Plato his tale of Atlantis. The eruption, around the 16th century BCE, was immense. It blasted apart most of the island, sent tsunamis across the Aegean, and covered parts of Crete in ash. But it wasn't the end of the Minoans. Archaeology on Crete shows that their cities, palaces, and pottery styles continued for at least another century. Colossus, their biggest palace, was still in use long after the eruption. And as for Atlantis, most historians see Plato's version as a work of philosophical fiction, not a coded map of the Aegean. 11. The Roman Empire didn't disappear in 476 CE. The Western Roman Emperor Romulus Augustulus was forced out by Odoacer, a Germanic leader, in 476 CE, and textbooks often mark that as the fall of Rome. But the Eastern Roman Empire, ruled from Constantinople, carried on for another 1,000 years, and its people still called themselves Romans. In the West, daily life kept going on just like it did before. Roman laws stayed on the books, Latin remained the main language, and much of the culture blended into the new Germanic kingdoms. As historian Edward J. Watts explains, most Italians in 476 wouldn't have said, "Rome has fallen." They still lived in a world shaped by it. The empire didn't disappear overnight. It did, however, gradually change into something new. 10. The fall of Carthage came without the salt. One of the Roman Empire's boldest revenge stories claims that once Carthage fell in 146, Scipio salted the earth to curse the land. It's an impressive tale. Historians always point out that none of the writers who describe the war mention this at all. Writers like Polybius, who was actually alive at the time, and Appian, who described the destruction in detail, never mentioned any salt. And archaeologists haven't found a trace of it in the soil of those areas either. The truth is, Rome simply tore the city down, sold survivors into slavery, and left the site in ruins. The salting story only pops up centuries later, probably as a symbolic metaphor for total destruction rather than an actual agricultural curse. 9. Polynesian seafarers didn't reach Pacific Islands by accident. It was long believed that Pacific Islands were discovered by accident when canoes drifted off course and hit land. Modern research shows that this is completely wrong. Polynesian sailors used generational knowledge about the stars, ocean swells, bird movements, and even cloud patterns to travel with precision. In 1976, navigator Malpielog sailed the traditional canoe, Hokulea, from Hawaii to Tahiti without any modern instruments and proved that these methods still work. Archaeological finds and language links actually show that they were making round trips across thousands of miles as early as the 13th century. That lucky drift story only stuck because early scholars underestimated them. Their journeys were the result of planned expeditions using skills passed down for hundreds of years. 8. Angkor was never really lost. The notion of Angkor Wat being stumbled upon like buried treasure owes more to European imagination than reality. Long after the Khmer Empire's political center moved in the 15th century, Buddhist monks and nearby villagers still lived around the temples and maintained them as sacred spaces. When the French naturalist Henri Mouhot finally arrived there in 1860, he wasn't hacking his way through the uncharted wilderness. He was taken there by Cambodian guides who knew the place very well. The Lost City label came later, when it got packaged into colonial-era adventure stories. Angkor was never hidden from the people who built it. The only ones discovering it were the ones who had never been there before. 7. Everyone didn't die before they hit 30. That everyone in the past died by 30 idea comes from a misunderstanding of averages. Yes, life expectancy in many ancient societies hovered around 30, but that number was dragged down by the huge number of children who didn't survive to adulthood. Once you made it past those dangerous early years, your odds improved dramatically. In ancient Egypt, for example, plenty of people lived well into their 50s and 60s. Medieval records show a 21-year-old could expect another 4 decades of life, easily hitting their 60s if disease or war didn't intervene. So turning 30 didn't mean you were limping toward the grave. It meant you'd already beaten the odds and can look forward to many more years. Assuming nothing else got to you, of course. 6. Most gladiator fights didn't end in death. Or with the thumb pointing up or down. Gladiators were valuable assets, not disposable entertainment. Renting one for a match was expensive. And if he died, the sponsor had to pay the owner a hefty penalty, sometimes close to 50 times the rental fee. On top of that, the years of training, food, and medical care made each fighter a serious investment. Their owners had every reason to keep them alive, and then some. A lot of the matches ended with a surrender rather than a kill, and the injured were patched up to fight another day. Historians estimate that only about 1 in 10 bouts ended with a fatal blow, which is far from the endless bloodbaths that pop culture likes to show. Although Gladiator is still one of my favorite movies of all time. 5. Gladiators weren't as toned like you see in the movies either. While I'm still talking about gladiators, I got one more for you, and then I'm done, I promise. Hollywood loves to show them as chiseled, handsome, buff warriors with six-packs. Damn. But they carried a good layer of body fat. Awesome, I'm a gladiator. You know, closer to those regular guys. Studies by anthropologists at the Medical University of Vienna who examined gladiator skeletons found that their diet was heavy on barley, beans, and other carbs, with very little meat. Roman historian Pliny even called them hordearii, or barley eaters. That extra fat wasn't a sign of poor fitness, it acted like built-in padding, and helped to protect their vital organs from deep cuts. The fights were still vicious, but a fighter with that protective bulk stood a better chance of walking away from a match in one piece than a gladiator. Yeah. 4. The Library of Alexandria wasn't lost in a single fire. If you go by the legend, or Spaceship Earth, the Library of Alexandria burned down in one unforgettable fire that instantly erased centuries of knowledge, and it smelled fantastic, apparently. But that's not how it happened. Part of the collection got burned in 48 BC when Julius Caesar's siege set ships in the harbor ablaze and the flames spread into the city. More may have been lost in the 3rd century during fighting under Emperor Aurelian, and by 391 when Patriarch Theophilus ordered pagan temples destroyed, anything still kept at the Serapeum might have been lost, but the library didn't disappear overnight. A lot of the works from its shelves still existed in other centers like Rome, Constantinople, and monastic libraries. It is a fact that scholars kept studying and writing long after Alexandria's decline. What was lost wasn't knowledge itself, but the convenience of having so much of it in one place. Sorry, Judi Dench. 3. Ancient Greek scholars didn't believe the world was flat. I think it's high time we put this one to bed now. Ancient Greek scholars didn't think the Earth was flat. In fact, the idea of a spherical planet was being discussed as far back as the 6th century BCE with Pythagoras, and by Aristotle's time it was widely accepted. Eratosthenes even calculated the Earth's circumference in 240 BCE using nothing more than shadows, geometry, and a bit of clever reasoning. The flat Earth until Renaissance narrative is a much later invention aimed at making the past, or people from the past, seem ignorant. Even educated clerics and scholars living in the Middle Ages were well aware that the planet was round. Nowadays, however, somehow that's everywhere. 2. Most Hebrews in Jesus' time didn't speak Hebrew. By the 1st century CE, Hebrew was still important, but it wasn't the everyday language most Jewish communities in Judea and Galilee used. It was mainly used in scripture readings and religious settings. In daily life, people spoke Aramaic, a related Semitic language that had been the region's common tongue for hundreds of years. Parts of the Old Testament, like sections of Daniel and Ezra, were even written in Aramaic. Greek was also widely spoken, especially in government and commerce, and many Jews read scripture in Greek from the Septuagint. That famous line from the crucifixion, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, meaning, my God, why have you forsaken me, is one of the clearest examples of Aramaic preserved in the Gospels. 1. People in the past were much shorter. Depending on who you ask, ancient people were either massive, giant-like figures, or tiny by today's standards. Archaeological evidence shows that human height has always fluctuated, and that had more to do with health and nutrition than the era itself. In the early Middle Ages, men in parts of Europe averaged around 5'8", or 173 centimeters, but by the 17th and 18th centuries, averages had dropped closer to 5'6", or 167 centimeters, thanks to poorer diets and widespread disease. Over the last 150 years, better food, healthcare, and living conditions have added about 4 inches to average height in developed countries. So while height does change over time, it's not a straight line of evolution. It's a reflection of how well people were eating, growing, and staying healthy in any given century. And that's a wrap. But hold up, I'm about to see if you were paying attention. If you added up every known section of the Great Wall of China, how long would it be? Is it A, 10,000 miles, B, 15,000 miles, C, 17,000 miles, or D, 13,000 miles? And would you walk that to lay down at your door? Drop your answers in the comments below, and while you're at it, let me know which myth on today's list surprised you the most, or which ones I should have added. If today's list scratched that history itch, you'll love our related video, 25 Ancient Myths that archaeologists want you to forget. It's got Columbus, Indiana Jones, and a whole lot of history that didn't happen the way you think. The link to that video will pop up right here in a second, and as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you again next time. I'm gonna go dig a hole.